Around this past summer in Florida, there was a competition so dangerous that many people thought it was just a joke, the Florida Python Challenge. But it's completely real, and just like its name, the competition has one purpose: hunting pythons. This year, it broke an all-time record: 934 hunters from 30 states and Canada, coming from all kinds of backgrounds, veterans, farmers, engineers, even celebrities. The rules are extremely simple. For 10 days, whoever catches the most pythons wins. No guns, no traps, no electric devices. And the prize? $10,000 in cash, big enough to attract people willing to risk their lives. After 10 days, a total of 294 Burmese pythons were caught a new record. The winner of the ultimate grand prize was Taylor Stanberry, a woman who single-handedly took down 60 pythons in just 10 days. Think about that. That's 6 pythons a day in a place where only 1% of the area is accessible by vehicle or on foot. 294 pythons. May sound like a lot, but in the wild there are an estimated 100,000, 300,000 Burmese pythons, meaning the yearly competition only touches about 0.3% of the population. This is also why the event must be held every year. Since the 2000s alone, more than 23,000 pythons have been removed, yet the ecosystem is still heavily damaged. Besides this method, they've actually tried many others. They once tested drones with thermal cameras, but it failed because pythons are cold-blooded. They tried using detection dogs. At one point, researchers even considered using American alligators, one of the few natural predators, but Burmese pythons grew so large that they ended up swallowing the alligators instead. But Florida isn't the only place facing a reptile disaster. Halfway across the world on the island of Guam, things are just as alarming. This is an isolated volcanic island, a greenhouse island ecosystem where forest, birds, bats, crabs, and lizards evolved with absolutely no native snake species. And then everything collapsed because of a single incident after World War II. Brown tree snakes, which can grow up to 2-3 meters long, accidentally arrived on drifting military cargo ships. With no natural predators and endless prey, their population exploded. Within just a few decades, the snake density on the island reached an unbelievable number: 13,000 snakes per square mile, the highest on the planet. To put it into perspective, that's a snake density 130 times higher than a typical forest. So high that if you looked at almost any tree trunk, you'd likely see one coiled on a branch. The venom of the brown tree snake is classified as mildly venomous. To humans, a bite usually causes pain, swelling, and numbness. But for Guam's birds and small animals, creatures that never evolved to deal with snakes, that mild venom became a death sentence. Just like every ecological collapse before it, the entire system fell apart. Within just a few decades, 10 out of 12 of Guam's forest bird species disappeared completely. And once the birds vanished, the island's ecosystem collapsed like a row of dominoes. Spider populations skyrocketed, increasing by more than 40 times, covering the forest canopy with webs. Tree species that depended on birds to spread their seeds stopped regenerating. Guam's forests began aging without ever renewing, like a body rotting from the inside. Fewer young trees meant fewer roots to hold the soil, making the island far more vulnerable to erosion, landslides, and flash floods. But that's not all. Guam is a critical link in the United States military strategy, home to radar systems, air bases, and major defense infrastructure. Yet, brown tree snakes are so skilled at climbing utility poles that the island suffered constant power outages, disrupting both military and civilian operations for years. And worst of all, imagine this. If you were a resident here, living in a place where snakes showed up everywhere, what would your life look like? We'll leave that to your imagination. Guam became so desperate that they were forced to launch a biological control campaign that sounds like a joke, but is 100% real, dropping dead mice from helicopters to kill snakes. Yes, you heard that right, a half-ecological, half-military operation unlike anything in human history. It all started with one seemingly simple question. How do we get poison into the mouths of brown tree snakes in the exact places where they hunt? Brown tree snakes don't just crawl on the ground. They are expert climbers, able to move along power lines like a strand of uncooked spaghetti. They hunt birds in the canopy, which means dropping bait on the ground is completely useless. Ecologists spent 3 years researching just to confirm something that sounds so absurd it's almost funny. Brown tree snakes prefer eating dead mice hanging in trees rather than live mice on the ground. When this was confirmed, the mouse paratrooper plan was born. These mice were not ordinary mice. They were stuffed with acetaminophen, the same medicine you take for headaches, but a lethal toxin for brown tree snakes. Humans have enzymes that break down low doses of acetaminophen. High doses only become toxic to the liver. But snakes don't have those enzymes. They're so sensitive that 1/16 of a pill, just 20-25 milligrams, is enough to cause total liver failure. The toxin builds up, triggers acute liver collapse, and kills the snake shortly afterward. So why use dead mice instead of live ones? Imagine loading thousands of live mice onto helicopters and tossing them into the forest. Impossible to control the dosage, inhumane, and basically unworkable. Dead mice are different. Easy to store, easy to dose, and they don't run around. Next came the sewing of parachutes. To drop 2,000 mouse paratroopers, the technical team had to make nearly 3,000 mini parachutes because more than 30% tore during testing. Each parachute was lighter than a sheet of for paper, but strong enough to keep the mouse hanging as it landed on the canopy. Why hanging? Because if the mice fell to the ground, the snakes might never reach them. Coconut crabs, feral cats, and wild pigs could eat them in seconds. These flights were mapped out as carefully as a military mission. Helicopters flew so low their rotors nearly brushed the treetops, releasing the mice in a parabolic arc. From a distance, the forest looked like it was snowing, except it was a storm of poison-laced mice. A scene both bizarre and brilliant. Each flight could drop only 100-150 mice, meaning the team had to conduct nearly 20-25 flights, costing up to $8 million USD just for the first phase. Not a small price. Now we'll go back to Florida. Many experts have asked why, if the method works so well in the place with the highest snake density in the world, Florida hasn't tried it. The short answer is, Florida is hundreds of times more complex than Guam. Let's break it down. First, the scale says everything. Guam is so small you can drive from one end of the island to the other in less than 2 hours. Florida? It's 300 times larger, stretching across the Everglades, a massive ecosystem of swamps, mangrove forests, sawgrass marshes, and winding waterways. What Guam can do with precise helicopter drops is something Florida simply cannot replicate. Even rescue helicopters struggle with the terrain here, let alone trying to drop mice onto exact treetops. Next is predator behavior. In Guam, brown tree snakes are easily lured by dead mice hanging in trees. But Burmese pythons? Not at all. In the wild, they prefer warm, moving, heat-emitting live prey. Many native Florida snakes, like rattlesnakes, have extremely sensitive heat-sensing pits and can instantly distinguish live prey from dead bait. And unlike Guam's simple island ecosystem, with just a handful of bird, lizard, and bat species, Florida is an ecological Jurassic Park. 45 native snake species, 700 land animals, 200 freshwater fish species, and 1,000 marine species. In Guam, poison mice would only be eaten by brown tree snakes. In Florida, any species could accidentally swallow them. As for Burmese pythons, if Guam's brown tree snakes are troublemakers, then Burmese pythons are apex monsters. They can reach 5 meters long, survive a full year without eating, swallow a 30-pound deer, baby alligators, and even bobcats. Compared to a 20-gram mouse, it would take a huge amount, an unrealistic amount, to even make them full. The cost is another massive contrast. Guam dropped 2,000 mice and spent $8 million USD. For Florida to achieve anything similar, they would need hundreds of thousands of mice every year. A campaign like that wouldn't just be expensive, it would be logistically impossible. And finally, ethics. Guam already faced backlash from PETA because the snakes died slowly and painfully. With a campaign hundreds of times larger, Florida would trigger a storm of controversy no state government would dare to face. But Florida hasn't stopped. Recently, they've tried methods even more daring than the annual python hunting competition. Let's start with the approach that makes many people laugh the first time they hear it. Robot rabbits used to lure Burmese pythons. The idea came directly from the python's own preferences. In the Everglades swamps, Burmese pythons, especially like hunting marsh rabbits, a species that's medium-sized, nutritious, and easy to detect through infrared senses. But using real rabbits would be too expensive and dangerous. So engineers came up with a solution: create robotic rabbits. Each robot rabbit has a fur-like outer shell, runs on solar power, moves with a wobble like a real rabbit, and most importantly, emits heat. This artificial heat fools Burmese pythons into thinking it's live prey. Inside the rabbit is a signaling system. When the camera detects a python approaching, it sends an alert back to the control center, and within minutes, a professional python hunting team rushes in and captures the python before it can swallow the fake prey. Sounds strange, right? But Florida deployed 120 robot rabbits during the first testing season at a cost of about $4,000 each. Expensive, but effective. They don't need food, don't need care, don't get sick, and can work 24, 7 inches flooded environments. If the python is too cautious, simple ecologists can coat the robot with real rabbit scent, turning it into a real rabbit in every practical sense. But robots only solve a tiny fraction of the python problem. Burmese pythons are so well camouflaged that people can literally step on one without ever noticing. So Florida had to bring in professionally trained python-sniffing dogs. You might wonder, why dogs? But dogs have been used in wildlife research for decades, from finding bear scat to locating snow leopard territories. Their strength lies in their sense of smell, 10,000 to 100,000 times stronger than humans. And when trained properly, they can distinguish the scent of Burmese pythons. But the Everglades isn't a park. Dogs must deal with soaked terrain, deep mud, sharp limestone, alligators waiting in the water, and venomous native snakes on land. To work here, they have to be trained in heat and humidity, tolerate insects, and most importantly, avoid engaging the python directly, because a Burmese python can crush a dog's ribs in seconds. So handlers train them to simply alert and retreat immediately. The two most famous dogs in the program are Truman and Eleanor, two black Labradors. They work 5 days a week, sniffing through every patch of grass and every forest edge for signs of pythons. Amazingly, there were days when Truman found 4 pythons in areas where human teams found none at all. But Florida still didn't stop there. They came up with an even smarter solution, using a native snake to eat the invasive one. Enter the eastern indigo snake, a large, non-venomous predator known for eating other snakes, even venomous species. This species was once locally extinct in many places, but ecologists decided to restore it to take advantage of its snake hunting ability. Over 9 years, they released more than 200 indigo snakes back into the wild. There is even video showing an indigo snake killing and swallowing a juvenile Burmese python, an image that shocked the conservation community. Indigo snakes, of course, cannot take down adult pythons, but they are extremely effective at eliminating juveniles, reducing the number that reach adulthood and reproduce. Researchers are developing gene drive technology, tracking DNA to predict python movement patterns, exploring ways to implant biological microchips, and even considering using bacteria to disrupt python reproduction. At the same time, Florida residents are being urged to practice responsible pet ownership and avoid releasing pet pythons or snakes into the wild, the exact mistake that sparked the Burmese python disaster back in the 1980s. There's a truth many people don't know. Florida has used aerial bait drops before, just not for pythons, and not in the Everglades. And when applied to the right species, the method actually saved an entire ecosystem. In 1997, ecologists in Florida distributed more than 130,000 oral rabies vaccine baits across Pinellas County to prevent rabies from spreading to raccoons and other wildlife. After just a few years, rabies rates dropped sharply and almost disappeared. Starting in 2024, the USDA even turned this operation into an annual program, using airplanes for rural areas, helicopters for the suburbs, and walking teams for city zones. The baits were intelligently designed, extremely appealing to wildlife, but completely safe for pets and humans. And what about Texas? For nearly 30 years, the state has dropped around 800,000 rabies vaccine baits every year, maintaining a density of 25-27 baits per 4 square miles. If you look at the bait distribution map, Texas is almost wrapped in an invisible safety net. And these two examples create a powerful contrast to the Burmese python story. In the right place, on the right species, with the right tools, dropping bait from the sky can become a cure that brings an ecosystem back to life. But there is one thing that very few people notice when they look at cold numbers like 294 pythons captured. A 70% reduction in snake density, or more than 23,000 killed over 20 years. These figures make it easy to believe this is simply a technical battle, one that can be solved with enough money, enough technology, and enough people. But the reality is far more complicated than that, because behind every Burmese python, every brown tree snake, lies a much bigger question. Are we fighting nature itself, or are we trying to fix the consequences of our own mistakes? Burmese pythons did not invade Florida out of some malicious instinct. They did not cross oceans. They did not find their way to the Everglades on their own. Humans brought them there. In the 1970s and 1980s, Burmese pythons became fashionable pets in the United States. They were small, beautiful, with striking patterns, and they looked harmless. What no one told buyers was that a few years later, that pet could grow longer than the couch in their living room. When the snakes grew too fast, ate too much, and became impossible to manage, many owners made a simple choice. They released them into the wild. And the Everglades, with its tropical climate, abundant water, and endless prey, became a perfect paradise for this predator. Not one snake, not 10, but thousands of individuals were quietly released over many years, with no records and no control. The problem is this: nature does not have an undo button. Once a top predator takes hold, reproduces, and spreads, you cannot simply say sorry and expect everything to return to normal. Ecosystems run on momentum, and once that momentum shifts off course, it triggers a chain reaction of consequences that can take decades or even centuries to reverse. Studies in the Everglades show that in less than 20 years after Burmese pythons appeared, populations of medium-sized mammals such as marsh rabbits, raccoons, foxes, and bobcats declined by 80 to 99% in many areas. Some species have nearly disappeared from the biological radar, not because they're fully extinct, but because their numbers have dropped so low that they're rarely seen in the wild. And when these animals vanish, the things they once controlled begin to explode. Small rodents increase, insects increase. Vegetation is stripped bare in some regions, while other areas are overtaken by invasive plants because native seed-dispersing animals are gone. The Everglades begins to change its internal structure slowly but relentlessly. What is most frightening is that these changes do not shock us right away. There is no sudden collapse, no doomsday moment. Just year after year, the ecosystem grows quieter, poorer, and less diverse. A slow death that almost no one notices. That is why python control efforts in Florida cannot rely on a single campaign, whether it is hunting, robots, trained dogs, or genetic technology. Each of these methods, when used alone, is nothing more than a temporary patch on a widening crack. Florida has been forced to accept a hard truth. There is no scenario of total eradication. Unlike Guam, where brown tree snakes were isolated on a small island, Burmese pythons have spread across a vast ecological network, connected by rivers, swamps, and wetlands stretching hundreds of miles. A single adult python can lay 40 to 60 eggs each year. As long as a few individuals survive, the population can rebound quickly. That is why Florida's real goal is no longer to wipe out pythons, but to hold them back long enough for native ecosystems to recover. It is a race with no finish line, only temporary checkpoints. And this is where Florida's story moves beyond a single state, a single snake, or a hunting competition. It becomes a global lesson in how humans confront invasive species. From lionfish in the Caribbean to feral cats in Australia, golden apple snails in Southeast Asia, and wild boars in Europe, every case began with small decisions that seemed harmless at the time. One animal transported, one species released, one ecosystem experimented on. And decades later, humanity spends billions of dollars just to keep things from getting worse. In that context, the Florida Python Challenge is more than a competition. It is a social message. It turns a complex ecological crisis into something the public can see, debate, and participate in. It helps Floridians understand that Burmese pythons are not just a problem for scientists and laboratories, but an issue unfolding right beneath their feet. But it also raises an uncomfortable question. Are we addressing the cause or merely treating the symptoms? Because as long as the exotic pet trade continues to exist, and as long as keeping non-native animals is treated as a personal hobby, new Floridas will emerge elsewhere. And each time, the cost will not only be measured in money, but in the permanent loss of ecosystems that can never be restored. Perhaps the most important lesson from the fight against Burmese pythons is not found in how many snakes are killed, but in how humans begin to rethink their role in nature, not as conquerors, not as all-powerful fixers, but as part of a system where even the smallest actions can trigger enormous consequences. In the end, the fight against Burmese pythons gives us a clear lesson. There is no miracle falling from the sky that can solve a disaster humans created themselves. Florida has to choose the harder path, combining science, technology, native species, and the entire community. But it's also the only path that can bring the ecosystem back into balance. And now, I want to hear your opinion. If you were the decision maker, which solution would you choose for the most dangerous invasive crisis in the United States? Leave your comment below. Don't forget to hit like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss more strange but true stories from the real world. See you in the next video.